I had no idea what a hard road my life would take. My once happy existence was crumbling before my eyes, turning into a nightmare. This tumultuous story spans almost 5 years, so please bear with me while I try to paint a complete picture of my life. Let's go back about 5 years to when everything started to fall apart. It all began with a shocking revelation concerning my wife and the father of my daughter's closest friend. For the sake of anonymity, let's refer to him as Sam. Just 4 months ago, the truth about Sam came to light when he finalized his divorce. As for my own marital journey, my wife and I had been together for about 20 years. During that time, we had children, an 18-year-old daughter and an 11-year-old son. Like any couple, we experienced many ups and downs, most of which were due to financial difficulties. While working in a city in California, we faced an exorbitant cost of living. Although our home is in an affluent neighborhood, it's important to note that our presence there is not due to wealth but rather luck. Pride and tradition run deep in our family, as our home has been an integral part of our history since the 1940s, passed down from generation to generation. I was fortunate enough to inherit this house from my father, who, in turn, inherited it from his father. Despite numerous attempts to convince me otherwise, including offers from my wife, I absolutely refused to sell this house because of its immeasurable sentimental value. In choosing to raise our children in this affluent neighborhood, we found ourselves surrounded by people of great wealth. Despite our modest incomes, our children grew up near their affluent peers, allowing them to develop a unique perspective on life. The pressure to provide our children with the same luxuries as their peers weighed heavily on my heart. It seemed like we constantly had to fight the desire for material goods that consumed our son and daughter. One particularly memorable incident was when my 11-year-old son came home with an expensive handheld video game console. I had promised him the same game as a New Year's gift, but due to our financial constraints, I was unable to fulfill that promise. During this period, urgent problems arose, and we were unable to satisfy my son's desire for a portable console. At first, when I saw the set-top box in his possession, I thought he had borrowed it from friends. But when he didn't return it for 2 days in a row, my concern grew. Curiosity got the best of me, and I asked him where he got it. To my surprise, my son told me it was a gift from Sam, the father of my daughter's best friend. Sam, who lives a few blocks away from us, is a divorced man with quite a fortune. His daughter is the same age as mine. Puzzled, I asked my son why he had turned to other people for help. He flatly denied any involvement in the requests, leaving me completely confused about the circumstances under which the set-top box had been purchased. My son explained that Sam showed interest in his interests and asked about his favorite video game. A few days later, to my surprise, Sam bought the game for him. This gave me mixed feelings. On the one hand, I wanted to express my gratitude to Sam for his generosity. On the other hand, I couldn't escape the feeling of sadness that I couldn't afford such a gift for my son without straining our finances. When the opportunity presented itself during a volleyball game where my wife usually took our daughter, I approached Sam and thanked him sincerely. He radiated friendliness, complimented by a sturdy build and tall stature. It was noticeable that he was older than I was, but his friendly presence made a favorable impression on me. In the past, my wife and I were a couple who attracted attention with our attractiveness. However, with the advent of parenthood, we gradually stopped paying attention. It wasn't until 3 months ago that a change came about when my wife decided to take up fitness and start training for a marathon. She would come home and tell me how she dropped our daughter off at a friend's house, where she and Sam had long conversations about fitness. It all seemed innocent, and my wife was open about her interactions with Sam. It is worth noting that our daughter and Sam's daughter have been close friends for some time. My wife has been taking our daughter to visit Sam for 2 years now, and it has become a habit. Lately, I have noticed a change in my wife's behavior when she talks about Sam. There seems to be a sense of heightened excitement coming from her. This sudden change made me suspicious, and I began to watch my wife's actions closely. During this vigilant observation, I noticed that the frequency of her visits to Sam with our daughter had increased significantly. Whereas she used to leave our daughter and go home on business, now she would bring her and stay at Sam's house. I became suspicious when I noticed that her car was always parked in the same place for long periods of time until it was time for our daughter to come home. To find out the truth without directly accusing her of cheating, I discreetly installed a GPS tracker on her car. This allowed me to track her movements and see where she went after leaving our daughter at Sam's house. Instead of getting into an argument with her, I decided to discreetly mention Sam's name in our conversations. Each time I did this, I watched her enthusiasm grow, and she spent hours enthusiastically talking about how wonderful he was and what positive qualities he possessed. I couldn't help but notice how my wife often talked about Sam's intelligence, wealth, and the property he owned. I had the impression that Sam was constantly impressing her with his successes, and she was eager to share these details with me. As a result of these conversations, I had the impression that Sam was deliberately bragging about his successes to my wife. Suspicious, I took on the role of an investigator and started poking around my wife's phone for any evidence. To my great surprise, I discovered that she was texting Sam more often than anyone else. These messages were filled with affectionate heart emojis and tender words like, "my love." This became a deep wound for me, and I felt betrayed. It turned out that this relationship lasted about 7 or 8 months, which coincided with the time Sam filed for divorce. I couldn't help but wonder if my wife had played some role in the dissolution of Sam's marriage. After stumbling upon the accusatory messages, I plucked up the courage to tell my wife what I knew about her infidelity. She reluctantly admitted to the infidelity, but evaded answering the question of when exactly she began her illicit affair. She apologized, insisting it was a mistake, but I had a hard time believing her words. We had a heart-to-heart talk about the future fate of our relationship, and to get some space for reflection, I asked her to leave our house temporarily. The protracted affair and the deep betrayal I felt made it unbearable to continue living under such deception. I made the difficult decision not to tell our daughter about my wife's infidelity, which created difficulties when it came to explaining why she couldn't visit her best friend as usual. Unfortunately, this allowed my wife to manipulate our daughter and make up various tall tales to turn her against me. She painted a distorted picture, claiming that my reluctance to allow them both to visit Sam was due to jealousy. Moreover, she went so far as to tell our daughter that I was lazy, calling my decision to separate from my wife proof that I lacked financial success. I decided to talk openly with my children, explaining to them that their mother and I were having difficulties in our marriage. I deliberately chose not to disclose the details of her infidelity and refrained from speaking ill of her. However, when she began to be unreasonably rude to me, it became evident that my wife had influenced my daughter's worldview. In response, I decided to punish her by taking away her cell phone. Unfortunately, her angry retort that Sam had bought her a new and better phone struck a nerve in me. I felt like I was losing the battle, and the emotional blow was very strong. With my wife's departure, I felt a loss of control over the situation and my family. 2 days later, my heart sank when I saw on the GPS tracker that her car had been left overnight at Sam's place. This event was the final blow to our crumbling marriage, and any glimmer of hope for reconciliation vanished at that moment. I may not possess great wealth, but I retain my dignity and refuse to subject myself to humiliation for the sake of money. There are aspects of life that are more important than material goods, and one of them is faithfulness. As a result of my wife's behavior, the foundation of honesty and integrity on which our relationship had been built had been shattered. It was with a heavy heart that I summoned the strength to call her and inform her of my decision to divorce her. To my dismay, she showed no sign of remorse. Instead, she coldly wrote me a message expressing her relief and anticipation of the divorce. These words hurt me deeply, and I struggled to find the words to convey the immense pain I felt inside. Overwhelmed with grief, I fell into a state of apparent depression and was unable to eat for 3 days. I felt like a mere shell of a person, a walking dead man. Despite the emotional turmoil, I worked hard to ensure the well-being of my children. However, my wife's actions left a trail of destruction in their wake. To enter into a new life with another person, one evening my daughter did not come home as I had taken away her cell phone. In frustration, I contacted my wife to inquire about my daughter's whereabouts. To my dismay, my wife told me that she was at Sam's house and intended to remain there from now on. This news infuriated me, and a heated argument ensued, accompanied by an exchange of derogatory phrases and profanity. In the midst of our conflict, my wife started calling me lazy. Expressing my frustration, I told her that I was unable to provide for a spouse of her caliber and that Sam seemed to have instilled in her that I was unworthy of her attention and had hindered her development over the past 20 years. The weight of her words was unimaginable, overwhelming me with anger and bitterness. Unable to bear the situation any longer, I impulsively drove to Sam's house and urgently contacted the authorities. When I arrived, I clearly stated that I demanded the immediate return of my daughter and even threatened to take her by force if necessary. When the police became involved, this tumultuous situation with my wife left me perplexed and frustrated. It was with great annoyance that she had to allow her daughter to come with me and return home. Overwhelmed by the feeling of annoyance, I couldn't help but direct my anger at Sam, addressing him with contempt. It was obvious that he wanted me off his property because of my inadequate behavior. In order not to cause a scandal, they decided to let my daughter go, but it was evident that she resented my forcibly removing her from Sam's house. With the help of the police, the similarity in her tone and words to her mother was striking. Even though I realized the influence she was under, I refrained from showing anger toward her. After this incident, my wife enlisted the help of an expensive lawyer funded by Sam. She was determined to expedite the divorce process. Upon receiving the divorce papers, I approved of the divorce but disagreed with the proposed child custody arrangement, which prompted us to go to court. It became clear that she was not interested in claiming any property from me, as I had nothing of value except the cherished ancestral home, which was not subject to division by virtue of the fact that it had belonged to me before the marriage. It dawned on me that the reason my wife and Sam hired an expensive lawyer was because of their intention to gain full custody of our children. They accused me of manipulating the children against their mother. When the case went to court, I was caught off guard. To my bewilderment, during a private interview with the judge, 2 of my children shared with him allegations of physical and verbal abuse against me. Unfortunately, my legal representation, while the best I could afford, was inadequate. Taking advantage of my actions the night I went to the police, my wife's slick lawyer skillfully used the incident to his advantage. Desperately searching for my missing daughter, I got the police involved, and my behavior at the scene was perceived as inadequate. I was utterly bewildered when I learned that my wife had gone to such lengths as manipulating our children to fabricate a story in front of a judge. Despite this betrayal, I held no grudge against my children, believing that as they grew up, they would realize that my only fault was my lack of wealth. Unfortunately, my wife emerged victorious from the bitter court battle, effectively destroying our once happy family. This was a profound wake-up call for me. Rather than wallow in despair, I refused to be idle within the walls of my home. I made a conscious decision not to drink alcohol and not to succumb to self-pity. Fortunately, my job offered free therapist services for people in difficult situations like mine, and I was happy to take advantage of this opportunity. In addition, on my own initiative, I joined a gym and started exercising. Exercise became an outlet for my anger and resentment. Although I realized that it was unjustified to direct my anger at my children, I couldn't shake the feeling of betrayal. Nevertheless, I constantly reminded myself that as a father, I had a duty to protect and provide for them, no matter what the circumstances. The situation was further complicated by the fact that just a month after the divorce, my wife obtained a restraining order against me. This unfair accusation not only led to separation from my children, but also resulted in a restraining order against me. Despite the ordeal, my family and friends gave me valuable advice, urging me to keep my composure and avoid unwise actions. Thanks to their support, I devoted my full attention to my professional life, paying great attention to my physical and mental health. During this difficult period, I withdrew from the family for a few months, deciding that they would be better off without me. After the divorce, my wife made significant changes in her life. She bought a new car and quit her job to become a stay-at-home mom for her new family, which included our 2 children as well as Sam's 3 teenagers, including a daughter and 2 sons. I was overcome with anxiety when I realized that my 18-year-old daughter was now living under the same roof with 2 unrelated teenage boys. Helplessness overwhelmed me when I realized there was little I could do to resolve this troubling situation. For months had passed since the divorce, and in that time, I had managed to change for the better physically. New friendships were made, and I even started going on interesting dates. The divorce and subsequent custody proceedings seemed to have done me good, and I had a lot of free time on my hands. But despite all the outward changes, deep down, I felt an undeniable emptiness. The absence of children from my daily life left a void that no amount of personal growth could fill. Longing for the joy of raising my 2 children, I decided to visit my son during a school break. When I saw him on the playground, a wave of anticipation coursed through my veins. Our eyes met, and in that moment, his face lit up with pure delight. Without thinking, he rushed toward me, his little legs carrying him as fast as they could. With all his strength, my son came to me and hugged me tightly. We found the nearest bench, and sitting down on it, he eagerly poured his heart out, recounting all the details of life at Sam's house, from the latest toys to the exciting video games. He spoke animatedly, and happiness and well-being were evident in every word. But amidst his enthusiasm, there was a wistfulness in his voice, a longing to know when he would be home. Tears welled up in my eyes as I was touched that, despite my financial difficulties, my son still longed for home, even when the charms of Disneyland were in front of him. In that moment, I experienced a sense of pride in being a father. I made it clear to my son that our visit should remain our little secret, hidden from his mother and sister. Determined to keep in regular contact, I made a commitment to visit him at least once a week. Our moments of companionship were brief, but they were of immeasurable value. As he prepared to return to his classroom, I cherished those precious minutes, savoring our conversations and the warmth of our connection. During one of these encounters, my son casually mentioned that he had seen my daughter crying. I brushed it off at first, not giving it much thought. After all, tears can be shed for a variety of reasons. But on another occasion, he told me that he had repeatedly seen his ex-wife in upset feelings as she cried. These stories sent a wave of concern through me. Although I couldn't pinpoint the exact reasons for their tears, it was clear that both my daughter and my ex-wife were experiencing emotional distress that I wasn't paying attention to. Sometimes I couldn't help but wonder why they were crying. Curiosity made me ask my son why his mom was upset, forgetting for a moment that he was just a little boy. I inundated him with questions, hoping to get some clarity, but it quickly became apparent that he didn't understand the complexity of adult emotions. He couldn't give any intelligible answers, leaving me in a state of uncertainty. Even though I didn't understand anything, a sense of contentment overwhelmed me when I returned home. Realizing that there were problems in paradise brought a perverse sense of satisfaction. I felt a perverse pride knowing that the only time in my life I had made her cry was when I confronted her infidelity. It gave me a sense of reassurance that she was no longer my problem. One day, I got a call from an unfamiliar number, but the course of events took an unexpected turn. When I picked up the phone, I was alarmed by the unfamiliar voice on the other end. Before I could say a word, the caller abruptly ended the call, leaving me confused. This situation was repeated for several days, and when I tried to answer the call, the caller invariably hung up on me. Puzzled by this mystery, I plucked up the courage to call back. Despite the call, the caller remained silent, refusing to engage in conversation. This mysterious picture continued periodically, leaving me completely perplexed and wanting to find answers. A suspicion arose in my mind that the caller could be my daughter. To confirm my hunch, I decided to call back from another phone. Just as I suspected, my daughter's familiar voice came through the receiver. Frightened and anxious, I quickly disconnected the call. It was clear that something was wrong with my daughter for contacting me in such a secretive way. I was overwhelmed with thoughts of what she was suffering. Is she in some kind of trouble? Does she long for my presence? I knew there was only one way to find out the truth. Just as I had gone to her brother's school at recess, I decided to visit her school as well. My sole purpose was to look for her, and eventually, I found her in the hallway accompanied by Sam's daughter. As soon as she saw me, her gaze lingered for a moment, then she quickly turned away and walked away. It occurred to me that perhaps she didn't want Sam's daughter to know about our meeting. Trying to reassure her, I sent a text message confessing that I knew she was the one who had called me. I emphasized that I would always be there for her when she needed me. Shortly thereafter, she got in touch and called me. Admittedly, our conversation was quite short, and not much was said on her part. Her answers were brief, and I got the impression that she just wanted to hear my voice. Determined to strengthen our bond, I made it a habit to call her every day. Instead of bombarding her with questions, I preferred to have one-way conversations. During one of these conversations, she suddenly began to repent for the humiliating comments she had made about me in court, attributing it to her mother's influence. Without dwelling on the past, I assured her that I had already forgiven her and emphasized that she would always be welcome in our home. It had been about 7 months since the custody hearing, and during a phone conversation, she expressed her desire to return home. After moving into Sam's home, her tearful confession piqued my curiosity, and I decided to inquire about her reasons for wanting to return, but she remained silent, refusing to divulge any details. I reassured her that she would always be welcome at home, but because of statements made at the child custody hearing, her mother currently had custody of the children. I proposed the idea that if she would tell her side of the story, her mother and I could work out joint custody to facilitate her moving between the two homes, but she abruptly declined, stating that she really didn't want to stay at Sam's house. Concerned that something might have happened, I decided not to push my inquiries on her for fear that it might alienate her. One day, we agreed to meet in the park to talk, and as we walked through the park, we began to discuss the matter. Trying to understand her sudden desire to go home, I started asking her questions, and then she broke down and told me that she was pregnant. My head spun, but I tried to stay calm and not give myself away with curiosity. I inquired about the length of her pregnancy and the identity of the culprit. To my horror, she told me that she had informed her mother about the pregnancy and they had decided to terminate it. This news struck me like a lightning strike. I could not comprehend that my daughter was not only pregnant, but had made such an important decision without my knowledge. I didn't realize that everything had changed. I felt dizzy with surprise, and I fell to the pavement, tears streaming down my face. At that moment, I felt like I had failed my daughter. Desperate for answers, I asked her to tell me who was to blame for her pregnancy. After a hesitant pause, she finally admitted that it was Sam's teenage son. The anger that erupted in me was almost uncontrollable. I craved revenge, determined to protect my daughter. I firmly promised her that I would do everything in my power to make sure she never returned to that horrible place. Without hesitation, I dialed my wife's number, expressing my dissatisfaction with her actions. I could not comprehend that my daughter had been subjected to such torture without my knowledge. It was clear from the muffled tone of her voice that she preferred to keep things private, pretending that everything was fine. But I couldn't just ignore this injustice. Anger burned within me, fueling my resolve to confront the perpetrators. Without thinking, I contacted my ex-wife's parents and informed them of the situation. Unwilling to let it go unchecked, the shocking details of their 18-year-old granddaughter's pregnancy and their own daughter's decision to terminate the pregnancy without informing anyone stunned me. In seeking justice, I got everyone on my side by showing her as a selfish and neglectful mother who had put her daughter in such a vulnerable position. Determined to protect my daughter, she stayed with me during that turbulent time, seeking legal protection. I went to the police, hoping for a criminal case, but to my horror, it turned out that since the boy was only a few years older than her, the situation was not covered by the law. The unspeakable anger I felt at that moment is beyond description. I desperately wanted someone to be held accountable for this unthinkable situation. In order to seek justice for my daughter's stolen innocence, I realized how important it was to maintain my composure, as overreacting could hinder my chances of regaining custody. During the upcoming custody hearing, I saw my ex-wife for the first time since my divorce, and her demeanor did not inspire joy. She looked disheveled, poorly dressed, and showed no signs of contentment. I experienced a sense of satisfaction as I watched the judge reprimand my ex-wife and her attorney for their deceptive actions, manipulation of my children, and the truth. Although she escaped serious consequences, luck seemed to be on her side. My ex-wife was found in contempt of court for her manipulative actions in getting our children to lie against me during a divorce custody hearing a few months ago. Although justice had been served to some extent, I couldn't escape the feeling that she deserved a harsher punishment, perhaps even jail time. It seemed unfair to me that if the roles were reversed, I would likely face harsher consequences. With the help of a skilled lawyer, I was able to secure primary custody of my children, while my ex-wife was granted supervised visitation. The court proceedings went in my favor, and I couldn't contain my joy as I left the courtroom, a smile stretching across my face. Recognizing the potential trauma my daughter had experienced, I wasted no time in getting her into therapy, hoping to aid in her healing process. My son, on the other hand, seemed to be doing well. To strengthen our bond, I purchased a 4x4 vehicle, allowing us to embark on off-roading adventures and spend quality time together. It was all he needed to thrive. As for my ex-wife, she only exercised her visitation rights on a few occasions. The visits between my ex-wife and our daughter eventually stopped, as my daughter absolutely refused to see her. Deep down, I felt that there was more to the story, secrets that my daughter had chosen to keep from me. Nevertheless, I found comfort in the fact that my family was reunited again. We made a conscious decision not to discuss my ex-wife and Sam within the walls of our home, and I refrained from speaking ill of their mother in front of the children. Over time, my daughter also ended her friendship with Sam's daughter. Although I didn't know the specific details, I decided to stay out of the way and not ask further. But just when I thought the storm had passed, for months later, my ex-wife unexpectedly filed for divorce from Sam. I couldn't figure out what was wrong, but some part of me found satisfaction in the fact that her life seemed ruined. Time passed, and 4 years later, my daughter, now 22, still had a strained relationship with her mother. It was obvious that their relationship was far from harmonious. While at first, I thought my daughter harbored a grudge against her mother for hiding the pregnancy, doubts began to creep in. I began to suspect that there was more to the story, hidden layers that I had yet to uncover. After the children were returned to my custody, I began spending as much time with them as I could, trying to rebuild our relationship. Our bond was stronger than ever, and one peaceful day, my daughter and I were relaxing on the loggia. I wondered for a long time why she disliked her mother so much. Finally, I mustered up the courage to ask her about it, hoping to get some clarity. At that moment, her demeanor changed. She lowered her gaze, then raised her head, and anger flashed in her eyes. The words that fell from her lips left me stunned and bewildered. She told me that she had confessed to my ex-wife that her man had done terrible things, and her mother, instead of protecting her, had chosen to cover for him. The silence that followed was deafening as she rose abruptly from her seat and walked away into the house, leaving me utterly confused. It took me a few moments to process the information she had just shared with me, and I frantically tried to understand her true intentions. Deciding not to jump to conclusions, I rose from my seat and hurried after her. After persuading her to sit down, I gently asked her to clarify her words. It was obvious that it was hard for her to tell the truth, but finally, she told me that the father of her child was not Sam's son but Sam himself. Shocked, I realized that he had been trying to buy her silence ever since my daughter had befriended him. After my daughter moved in with him permanently, it became clear that his intentions were far from innocent. Shockingly, he ended up getting my daughter pregnant. It dawned on me that perhaps my daughter had been his target all along. In a panic, my daughter told my ex-wife about her pregnancy, hoping for support and protection, but the ex-wife seemed more concerned with keeping me unaware of the situation. Eventually, my ex-wife told Sam everything. Although I don't know if they resolved the matter in private or behind closed doors, they managed to convince my daughter to have an abortion. Shocked by these revelations, I wasted no time and immediately went to the police to seek justice. We filed a police report, and although Sam had already moved out of the neighborhood, law enforcement managed to apprehend him at his new place of residence. To our surprise, my ex-wife was later arrested as well. After taking a plea bargain, she admitted her involvement and became a key witness in the case. As a result, she received a relatively short sentence of 6 months followed by probation. In contrast, Sam was sentenced to 22 years in prison. Given the nature of his crimes, it is likely that he will face danger within the prison walls when his cellmates learn the true extent of his actions. I intend to do everything in my power to seek justice and ensure that he receives the punishment he deserves.
Dear listener, if you have reached this far, please click on the subscribe button. It will be a great help.